Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to see you all. It's getting quite familiar now to all of us, including how to work this, of course, but I'll go through the procedures in a second. But welcome to this slightly controversially or naughtily entitled virtual roundtable. Belarus, this time it's different, question mark. And I suppose the question is it? We have, of course, been here before. You're all well versed in Belarus matters, so you will find some familiar echoes of almost a decade ago, but at the same time, things do seem to be substantially different this time, and we will examine precisely how. Not least actually from our first speaker, Riho Astapenia, who has designed the greater part of this event. So my thanks in particular to Riho, my colleague there. So the slight payoff for there being as many speakers as 5 today is that I have asked them to speak for just 5 minutes only. So very brief opening remarks. I'll go through them in just a second. That'll leave us an hour for questions and discussion. As I say, we will start with Riho, with my colleague, answering exactly that question. Is this election campaign in particular genuinely different? What are the similarities, what are the differences? Then to my other colleague, Anais Maran, who as well as being an Associate Fellow at Chatham House is also the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus. And therefore, Anais will be asking the question, or will be looking at the level of human rights violations this time around. Then we'll move to Marina Rachlé, who is a Senior Program Officer at the GMF. Marina will look at the international dimension to this, asking if the West can do anything in the light of this new wave of repressions we've been seeing over the last couple of days, weeks, and months now. Then we move to my other colleague, Nikolai Petrov. Kolya is the Senior Research Fellow on the Russia and Eurasia Program. And while he normally looks at Russia's domestic affairs and be well known to most of you for that, then Kolya has bravely offered to answer the question of what might Russia do if it does go differently this time. It's already changed its position vis-a-vis Belarus, of course, but what might happen if there is something more substantial in the offing? And then finally, we will turn to Andrei Kazakovich, joining us from Minsk. Andrei is the Director of the Institute for Political Studies there, and he will just look at scenarios, potential scenarios over the coming, in the medium term, if you like, for Belarus. So that's about it. I will just say a couple of other things. First of all, if my connection goes down, as it is wont to do these days, then my colleague Keir Giles, waving there from his Northamptonshire back garden, will take over from me. After the half hour or so of initial remarks, then we'll do questions in the usual fashion, which means either you can raise your electronic hand, probably not your physical hand, because I probably won't see you. That's in the participants tab. But you can also write in the chat function, another tab on the bottom of your screen, either to me directly, in which case I'll assume that it's anonymous and I will not credit you if you like, or you can just go, there's an option for write to everybody and I'll read it out. So there are plenty of options. I know some of you may have written to Anna as well separately. So those are the rules, as well as this being an on-the-record presentation, and we may use it or parts of it to put up on the website. Depends how it goes, eh? So that's about it from me at this point. I will therefore hand over to Riho. Riho, thank you once again. You have 5 minutes, please. Your rules, not mine. Good luck, and thank you again.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon, everyone. I think that this election is really different, and I will just mention for the beginning 5 key changes. First of all, today Lukashenka has a low rating. While he actually hit his statistical low before, it never happened during the election campaign, and it really feels like a part of a long-term trend rather than temporary occurrence. In April, the state-funded poll showed that only 24% of Minsk dwellers trusted him, and I think that the electoral rating across the whole country somewhat close to this figure. And there are 2 main reasons why he's unpopular. First of all, is that Belarusian economy is not growing for the last 10 years, and the second one is his response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In a way, yesterday, by the registry in Babarika and and Tsipkala, he showed that actually his rating is indeed low, so he doesn't want to compete with them. The second change I should mention is that there is a more substantial involvement of citizens in politics. Well, I cannot say, well, I don't mean just protests, because actually they are still limited, but generally people are more involved in the campaign. They do join the initiative groups, they follow the news, they crowdfund to support victims of political repressions. Some would like to put their signatures. So people's involvement is stronger this campaign, and not only because they disappointed with Lukashenko, but also because there is an entire generation that grew without experience of political repressions. And it's probably one of the features of Belarusian political system that when the level of political repression decreases and level of fear decreases, protests become more crowded. One more reason for people's great involvement is the fact that the media landscape has changed. Social media, non-state media are more popular than ever. Thus, censorship of state media is not a great problem for opposition anymore, as they can reach the society through other channels. For example, Viktor Babarika has almost 300,000 followers on Instagram. So they really can reach the society without any intermediaries. And thanks to technologies, people can self-organize. Through crowdfunding, many people gave their money to support victims of repressions. And for example, yesterday's action was also organized through the internet without any actual organizers, political organizers. The appearance of new alternative candidates as Viktor Babarika, as Tikhanovsky, as Valery Tsipkala, the third change that I should mention, and they are these people are outsiders of the traditional opposition, and they are not associated with the previous political defeats. They haven't experienced them. On the one hand, well, it's good for them. On the other hand, it's very bad because they do not have an experience of running campaigns in such horrible conditions. Anyway, these new people resonate better with Belarusian society compared with previous opposition leaders. By the end of the day, Viktor Babarika collected almost 500,000 signatures without significant financial resources and actually without any real preparations. It would be a massive political success in any European country. The fourth change is that the change of the international context that we will mention later. On the one hand, Kremlin has reduced its support for Belarus because Belarus rejected Kremlin's proposals to integrate deeper. On the other hand, the West is reluctant to sanction Belarus for violations of human rights. And finally, the fifth change is the lack of any positive agenda of Lukashenko. Well, there are almost no election sweeteners. There are no election promises. What Lukashenko promises is just to keep the things the way they are. Recent appointments from this year show that there are no plans to change the economy. Our head of the presidential administration is from the KGB. Another Silovik is running the government, and the tactics of the authorities is for this election campaign is actually related to this lack of positive agendas. Political repression remain and will remain like the main mechanism for suppressing the popular vote. And these suppressions will secure Lukashenko's so-called victory re-election, but I think that most of these factors that I mentioned actually are not going away after the 9th of August. Thank you.
Thank you, Rihor. I must say that whilst I fully agree with the substantial changes by comparison to previous elections, and that last point of yours on the lack of promises did sound rather familiar. And so I suppose I ask you to keep in mind in the back of your head, maybe for later, the idea that this will, I'm sure Andrei will cover this, but this will all blow over. In fact, that it may look different now, but afterwards, come October, November, we may just see more of the same. Just bear it in mind for later and maybe store that up. Anais, over to you, please. So how bad is the human rights situation again compared to in previous times, please?
Well, as you all know, it is quite bad. It is structurally, systemically bad in Belarus when it comes to human rights and fundamental freedoms. But in an electoral year, especially during a presidential election, as Lukashenka says it himself, it's particularly straszny. The conditions for exerting their fundamental rights are extremely difficult for Belarusians. I noticed already in my 2019 report to the General Assembly that Belarusians cannot enjoy their fundamental right to participate in the public life of their country. And in that report, I raised three main issues. First, the quality of the electoral process. Second, the freedom of opinion and expression, which is unduly limited, and this is visible in terms of media freedoms. And third, freedom of association and peaceful assembly. In legislation and in practice, Belarus has been criticized in the past for lack of compliance with international standards for genuine and free elections. This led to repeated calls to address shortcomings and implement reforms, notably regarding voter registration, the composition of election commissions, which is totally dominated by the administration, and early voting arrangements, which are particularly worrying because, as in some other post-Soviet countries, the vote can start actually on the Wednesday prior to the election Sunday. The potential reforms have been at times envisaged, but none of the OSCE's recommendations and the one that myself and my predecessor at the UN made have ever been implemented. Since the last electoral cycle in 2015 and 16, there have been no amendments to the electoral code, and even simple measures such as requesting that each ballot paper be shown to observers during the vote count were not considered, which indicates a lack of willingness to guarantee transparency or to a willingness to hide possible manipulations of the outcome of the vote. So the legal and institutional frameworks remain conducive to practices that undermine the integrity of the electoral process and the right of citizens to participate in public affairs, the right to vote and be elected. And this has been particularly evident in recent weeks when, as a result of a selective, if not arbitrary consideration from the Central Electoral Commission, three of the most serious presidential contenders are being prevented from running. Hence the current protests in defense of their rights and for liberating the two of them who are currently in detention on dubious grounds. Second, regarding freedom of opinion and expression, the legal environment in Belarus is extremely hostile to dissenting opinions, and Belarus unduly restricts the right of journalists, bloggers, and civic activists to seek and disseminate information. And over the past years, there have been numerous cases of deliberate persecution against journalists who live under constant fear of retaliation. I can recall the Belta case with criminal charges against the head of a journal, of a newspaper. But in recent weeks, this has been evolving from bad to worse. And as I indicated last Friday to the Human Rights Council, where I presented my last report, based on the information that I received, there are at least 100 journalists and bloggers who have been arrested in the past couple of days. This is still not totally verified information. As you know, the situation is extremely fluid, so I'm not able to give precise figures. What I'm concerned about is indications that the authorities are already tampering on the free flow of internet communications by jamming Telegram channels. In the past, opposition websites have been closed down without a court decision. And this, of course, was predictable because for the past year, an amended law has further restricted the field for freedom of expression on the internet. And now only duly registered media, journalists and bloggers are allowed to operate online, and those who publish without a registration can have their websites closed down by the Ministry of Information. And owners of registered online media may be held criminally liable for content posted by others on their website in the comments section, which means that basically several information platforms have switched off the comments section in order not to be held criminally liable. And last but not least, regarding freedom of association and peaceful assembly, in these fields there have been some cosmetic improvements over the past year, notably with the decriminalization of participation in an unregistered organization. That was the infamous Article 193.1 of the Criminal Code. So this repealing this article was positive. However, the downside is that such organizations are now subject to administrative liability and heavy fines instead. And as we have seen in the past weeks, several people have been fined actually for activities linked with an unregistered organization or for organizing unsanctioned mass events. And the law on mass events was also modified in a seemingly more permissive way last year with the introduction of a notification procedure. However, in practice, we have noticed that it was implemented in a way so as to restrict the freedom of peaceful assembly. And what we have seen in recent weeks is that, when in democracies, the level of tolerance for public discussion and eventually assembly during an election is usually higher, more dissenting opinions are allowed to be expressed to ensure meaningful political debates. But in Belarus, it's the contrary that happens in practice when further restrictions are applied. And as a result, it translates in the terrible scenes that we have seen since May of peaceful protesters and journalists, just passers-by, being violently arrested, sometimes by men in plain clothes. There have been records of people being beaten and suffering ill treatments in detention. And moreover, their right to a fair trial were not guaranteed as lawyers were not immediately able to communicate with their clients. So this said, this is a very brief overview. As a special rapporteur, what I'm very much concerned about now is the observable escalation of violence on both sides. As we have seen in just a couple of hours ago, the cases of passers-by actually intervening to protect people who were being beaten in the streets by people in plain clothes. And this is extremely, it can lead to an escalation, and I believe we will talk about a very different situation if ever blood is spilled in the street of Minsk during this electoral process. Thank you.
Thank you, Anis, and thank you for confirming, I suppose, that the situation is largely going from bad to worse, I suppose. Can I just ask you a quick question, Anis? Is the UN sending you there in your rapporteur capacity?
Sending me there? Well,
yes.
there's budget earmarked, and I'm supposed to, of course, go there in order to be able to assess the situation. However, the government doesn't recognize my mandate. It's been a constant position. And therefore, they don't communicate with me, and I'm persona non grata in my capacity as special rapporteur in Belarus.
I see. Thank you. Right, let's move to Marina Rakle, who deserves extra dedication points because I believe she's on holiday in northern Germany and has volunteered to do this. So Marina, thank you very much for agreeing to address the international angle to this, as the GMF, where you work, is wont to do. And I suppose the West has always had a problem with Belarus. It's in spite of Belarus not having much leverage, it has no oil, I suppose, then the West has failed to effect any change. Which, so what begs the question is, can it, does it even want to, or should it? So that's quite a lot of questions in your 5 minutes. Over to you, Marina.
Yes, thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I am very delighted to be part of this distinguished podium and talk about Belarus yet again. Yes, it's of course true that Belarus is obviously not the #1 foreign policy priority in the West. But talking about the international reaction, I would identify 3 main areas: internal, external, and institutional. Talking about the internal dimension, this time there are no EU flags, for example, looming about the protesters, which has always been the case before. Yes, the oppositional political parties no longer play the major role, but on the other hand, you see national, historical, white, red, white Belarusian flags. So for the populations, for the protesters, it's a very internal affair that's going on. Externally, a massive wave of solidarity from Warsaw to Bali. It has to do with some of the reasoning that Rehor already addressed. On the one hand, these are political refugees. This is the generation that has never experienced repression in Belarus. They are somewhere else now, and they are appalled that things that are happening in the country shouldn't be taking place. On the other hand, these are very regular also Belarusian citizens, again, conductor organizing protests in Berlin currently. So we see the same trends taking place in Belarus, and they mirror basically in other countries in the West, also thanks to social media and the increased normalization of the use of them. Institutionally, Brussels and what the reactions of the Brussels and the United States. Since 2004, 2005, there have been sanctions in place, especially when talking about the European Union. This is this oil tanker mentality, with one decision having been taken, and then it's very difficult to adjust it to the situation that is changing in Belarus. So basically the sanctions that have been in place, and then there have been another steps with repressions, and then sanctions again. So this is what we see this time is nothing new, not in Belarus in terms of how the government reacts, not on part of the Western partners. There have been official statements, a lot of them. There have been a hearing in the European Parliament. When the West reacts, the Western institutions, basically their goal is to, on the one hand, defend the Western values, rights and freedoms, on the other hand, to offer support to civic groups or population groups who are not, who do not agree with what is happening in the country. Basically, what will happen is the extension of this dual track policy towards Belarus. On the one hand, probably individual targeted sanctions against officials who were involved in repressions and manipulation of the results of the election. On the other hand, the increased support to the civil society, which has dropped substantially in the last years, and probably more openness towards Belarusian people, more programs, European programs that will be open to Belarusian youth, to Belarusian students, and probably this visa liberalization that is in place since July. And I would stop there.
Thank you. Just on that very last point, Marina, just for clarification purposes, I wasn't quite clear. You said that support for civil society has dropped, there'll be increased programs. Could you just clarify that for me, just slightly? I may have misunderstood you perhaps, but you said support for civil society has dropped, but there'll be increased number of support programs.
Yes, there have been a number of development programs that were open to Belarusian political parties and civic groups, and the funding has been decreasing in the recent 5 years. All
right, understood. Thank you. We move swiftly on. Thank you everybody for keeping to time. We are absolutely on time. So I move to Nikolai Petrov. Kolya, again, thank you for doing this. And although the relationship with Russia has already changed, of course, and obviously relationships between Lukashenka and all manner of countries, go up and down, but it has undoubtedly worsened in the last 6 months for reasons we all know, I'm sure you will cover. But I suppose we'd also all like to know, if you don't mind me adding an extra question for you, Kolya, but if I don't know to say the worst, but if some form of uprising, revolution, change of government occurs after the election, then ultimately the question is will Russia intervene? So hopefully you'll cover that one for us as well, Kolya. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, James. I think it's not the best time to have elections due to the fact that almost all serious actors are too much focused on domestic problems, which makes Belarusian elections much easier in view of the Kremlin than those which took place before. So we do not see any signs of serious Russia's intervention. And it has been repeated today by Dmitry Peskov, spokesperson for Putin. And even media coverage in Russia is very, very limited. So the major reason why is that there is idea at the Kremlin that Belarus cannot go anywhere regardless of who governs it. And these elections will not strengthen either Lukashenka or let's imagine that anybody else will come to power. So economy of Belarus is not perhaps sustainable without Russia's assistance, which is very much limited now. And that's the reason why the Kremlin is pretty calm with regard to what's going on. Speaking about the Union State, I would say that this project is still on the table. Not that much it's important for Putin in terms of 2024 problem, it's almost solved. But it's important for Putin to position himself as the founding father, not to be the second president of Yeltsin's Russia, but to become, the president of Putin's Russia. And that's why the State Duma should discuss denunciation of Belarusian treaties. So I'm sure that negotiations on the Union State will continue after elections. And my last point is that in case of Russian-Belarusian relations, we should see a kind of very rational approach from both sides, because it's known that both Lukashenko and Putin hate each other, but nevertheless, they are forced to, if not to make friends, then at least to cooperate. And although their statements can be harsh, they do not have any real choice. And this makes, the bilateral relations between Russia and Belarus pretty much stable and predictable. And although James has mentioned that I'm not a great specialist on foreign policy, I would add that in Russia, what is going on in post-Soviet states, except for Baltic states, is not considered to be foreign policy. It's closer to domestic politics first, and second, there is a very good interview describing Russian position with regard to Belarus made by Fyodor Lukyanov, taken by Yuri Drakokhrust, and this is very interesting. Thank you.
Kolya, I regard you as a foremost specialist on the Russia and Eurasia program, you know that. Can I just put to you, Kolya, the question that I tried to ask at the beginning, which, and I'll put it differently then. Under what circumstances, Kolya, might Russia intervene with muscularity?
I do not think that there is any real possibility of this kind, if especially to have in mind what Marina has told, that there are no pro-European candidates, and Europe is staying a little bit aside. So the Kremlin should be not afraid of any kind of European expansion into this area.
Fair enough. I look forward to if anybody wishes to challenge that later in the questions. So we move on to our last speaker. Andrei, you've left my... Oh, no, I have you. Andrei, over to you. You have this the scenarios job, always a thankless task, partly because, of course, normally people sort of produce these sort of good, bad, and ugly scenarios, or the same, not much change and a lot of change. So I guess it's a similar question to one that I asked Nikolai just now, Andrei, which is, the likelihood of a revolution, and it just not just the likelihood though. Can I just add to your troubles and ask you this? Not just the likelihood of a revolution, but the desirability of one, because it does seem to me that there's a substantial evidence which would suggest that for real change to happen in post-Soviet countries, revolution, a color revolution, tends to be necessary beforehand. So I just leave you with that slightly controversial point there, and but obviously say what you want to say. Go for your scenarios. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm in general agree with your thesis concerning revolutions. Of course, if we speak about scenarios concerning contemporary political situation in Belarus, it's very difficult to predict because it's extremely unstable. But in general, I think that Belarusian authorities has power and force enough to preserve the situation and to bring down the protest and to suppress alternative political activity and so on. Of course, the potential for protest is great now, and probably absolute majority of population doesn't want to see Lukashenka as a president of Belarus. But at the same time, I just don't see any political leaders which are not in jail. I don't see any political structures and institutions which can perform some kind of long political struggle or to organize political protests and so on and so forth. So I think that in general, Belarusian authorities have power enough and force enough to localize such protests and to preserve power, at least for the nearest future. At the same time, of course, we can expect the new wave of protests after elections in several months or within a year. But actually, the problem is the same. Just lack of political leaders and political institutions. So, of course, it's possible, but I don't think that some kind of popular revolution is likely in Belarus because of these reasons, because, and more probably probably an additional reason is that Belarusian authorities are ready for such scenarios and they are well prepared. The next scenario is some kind of Russia deep involvement in Belarus, but I don't think that this scenario is very, the probability of this scenario is high. Because as Nikolai say, actually for Russian elites, it's obvious that Belarus is the most dependent country concerning Russia influence. So the basic scenario is that contemporary president and in general contemporary system will preserve its power, yeah. But at the same time, this political system has a great number of challenges and a great number of problems concerning representation, legitimacy, trust, and so on and so forth. And in general, I think that it's dysfunctional, and it will be changed. Probably. The main intrigue is how quick and in what direction it will change. The political reform will not suppose democracy, but probably it will be more complex and more open and less repressive if we speak about some positive scenarios. But at the same time, it's very difficult to predict any details concerning this reform, and we shouldn't expect such reform just after elections.
Thank you for keeping to time, all of you. But on that last point, I mean, taking your conclusion there, Andrei, and this brings me to Rihor as well, back to the start, because is there a contradiction here? Maybe there's not, but maybe there is. You know, you're sort of saying that. You're sort of saying there's not going to be any substantial change as a result of this election, that things are going to continue more or less as normal, although obviously not in the long term. But at the same time, Rihor is maintaining that this time this is substantially different. So is there a contradiction between what you two are saying? Do you agree with each other, or is it the fact that somehow this time it's different, but not different enough to affect substantial change?
Yeah, I agree with Rihor concerning this very special situation. And I think that these elections just show that political system, which was created 2 decades ago, is dysfunctional now, and it will be changed. And these elections is the main reason why the discussion concerning constitutional and political reform is not very serious within Belarusian elite and so on. So, of course, these elections are very important concerning future political development of Belarus. But I just don't see any real organized political force which could introduce some alternative political scenario. Because we see that actually Belarusian authorities have possibility just to detain any political leader, just to destroy any political structure, just switch off internet and so on and so forth. So I think that we should more speak about some changes from the inside than from some popular movement, you know.
Okay, I think my idea of change was perhaps more radical than your idea of change. In fact, perhaps everybody's idea of change on this panel. Understood. Right, thank you again to all panelists. We have got just under an hour for questions and discussion, and I think that there will be several. I've already had a couple come through. The first is from the ever reliable Alex Folks, a former, currently former election observer for the OSCE. So we can guess what the question is going to be. What motivation, asks Alex, does the panel think lay behind the decision by the Belarus government not to invite the OSCE to observe the election? Although we observe elections with a fresh mind each time, he says, recent elections in the country have seen similar criticisms which the government has chosen to ignore, relying instead on the whitewash reports from the SCO and the CIS. Maybe from the OSCE as well, frankly, Alex. So what changed this time? And do you think the government has factored in any reaction from the West and what form that might take? So the best person to answer that question, can I maybe take that to Marina first? Over to you.
Yes, sure, gladly. I would suspect that there wasn't any decision that have been taken, because there is this span of time of 2 months that after the election date is set, that the government has to formally invite an OSCE or DIA mission, and there was no invitation. I'm not sure that there was a conscious decision not to invite the OSCE mission. It was probably that nobody wanted to take responsibility for the decision, and that's why there was basically no time left that it expired. Coming back to what Nikolai mentioned, Russia is this magic elephant in the room. It's a huge factor also for the West, because Brussels and the United States, they have been cautious with any reactions or decision to introduce sanctions against Belarusian government or very serious restrictive measures, because of Russia, because of then that basically Belarus will be pushed back into the arms of the Kremlin. Yes, it was the Belarusian government that maneuvered itself into this corner, but that's what the West is basically also trying to prevent with their steps, with their reactions, to push Belarusian government further into dependence of Russia. That would be basically my take. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Marina. Anybody else? Maybe Anais, this might be a question for you as well. Do you have an OSCE point of view?
Yeah, well, I have been an election observer, but now I can't comment on this. What I know is that the position of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belarus was pretty clear already a couple of months ago, and the news they were giving is that either there would be an invitation to all international observers or none. So from the news we got today, the OSCE or DIA will not send a mission because they didn't get an invitation. I don't know if the CIS has gotten one. But in a way, it's so of course no international observers is a bad sign, but no zombie observers from the CIS is maybe good news. However, it puts a serious challenge on the shoulders of the domestic observers, whose rights and possibilities to have meaningful observation are also extremely limited in Belarus. And I think it's urgent that donors and countries, embassies on location really invest in capacity building and any kind of protection of the material conditions in which domestic observers will try and conduct some observation in a way, one way or another. And exit polls are forbidden in Belarus. There is no sociological institution able to conduct really an appreciation, but anything that will help to determine the extent of the possible fraud will be useful for the future of the legitimacy of the outcome of the election.
Thanks very much indeed, Anais. Can I just ask people to try to send the questions, if they possibly can, to everybody in the chat function? That way, because if you lose me, if I lose my connection, if I lose you, then unfortunately it means I've lost the questions. So it's desirable to do it to everybody, because that is looking likely with my connection right now as it happens. Right, having said that, I am going to ask a couple of private questions that have been sent to me, just that whilst I can. The first one says, you have increased US interest and openness to Belarus. I'll try that again. You've seen increased US interest and openness to Belarus. Visit by Pompeo, LNG sales, promised return of an ambassador, etc. Is Belarus in play, or is there any real exercise, or is there any real interest by Lukashenko in positioning closer to the West? So obviously we've seen this before. Marina, go to you first again, if you don't mind. Lukashenko's vicissitudes with regards to his relationship with the West. Sometimes he wants to make friends, other times he backs away. So is Belarus in play again, or not?
I will have to get back to my previous point. This basically we're talking about bilateral relations, but that's a trio. This is Russia is always looming in the background. Even Americans traveling to Belarus and sending oil to Belarus. It's all about waving flags to Russia that they do have their own interests in the regions. And they're keeping it close, and they're keeping an eye on what Russia's plans are, and developing their own strategies. This is the same game that Lukashenko has been playing for years, trying to balance his foreign policy, being friends with Russia, but also being friends with the West, not relying on Kremlin support only, but also signaling to Kremlin, as soon as you stop supporting me or financing my government, my system, that I will turn to the West. And this is what Russia also trying to prevent. In this regard, I can probably ask a question to the colleague Nikolai, that you say that Moscow is not really going to intervene if there is a regime change in Belarus, if there's no West behind the candidate or a popular leader. Do you really think that Russia doesn't mind to leave its influence on Minsk?
I do think that the Kremlin is pretty much sure that Russia's influence in Belarus will not decrease. It's increase more probably in result of elections. And well, there is good expression in Russian, which perhaps is similar in Belarusian, "Ласковое теле двух маток сосет," meaning that good calf is milking two cows. This was all the time Lukashenko's position, who was balancing between Russia and the West. Now there is much less room for maneuver for him, and although he did not respond to Russia's attempts to get closer integration before elections, when it looked like he was pretty much dependent from money which could come from Russia, but he will not be capable to play this card after elections, neither him or whoever will come to replace him. So I would formulate Russia's position, official Russia's position, in such a way. Russia is absolutely not interested in any kind of regime changes except for pre-staged changes. That's why it hates any opportunities of such a development of events. But B, Russia is pretty much sure that there is no way out for Belarus under Lukashenka, whether he likes this or not, except for coming to Russia immediately after elections and asking for assistance in exchange for something. The problem I see is that Lukashenka is a very skillful politician who did manage to win against Putin for 2 decades. And his position with regard to Russia, as you know, is explained by the formula kisses in exchange for economic assistance or in exchange for oil. Now it doesn't work anymore, and this makes understandable troubles in Russian-Belarusian bilateral relations.
It's very interesting, Kolya, because it does seem to me that there's some precedent for Russia not always sticking by its man when it becomes disillusioned with its man. So in Kyrgyzstan, for example, they did eventually enforce the ouster of President Bakiev. And so whilst normally it wishes to continuity, it wishes to remain loyal to the incumbent autocrat, then there are occasional areas where Russia decides that it's had enough. But I take your point fully, nonetheless. There are more questions on Russia, Kolya, so you are going to be put to work again. But I'll just give you a rest for a second, and I'm grateful not for the first time to Anna Davidson, because she has raised an electronic hand rather than me having to read them all out poorly. So can we unmute Anna, please? Anna from the University of Oxford.
Yes, thank you, James. Hi, I have a question really for anyone who has an opinion on it from our panelists. Would you say that the COVID-19 pandemic presents an ideal time to have elections in Belarus or a not ideal time? Apparently, I would think Lukashenko sees something good about having an election right now.
That's a great question. Thank you, Anna. And it echoes the question from Richard Wright. So I'll ask it at the same time because it's connected. Richard has written not much from the speakers on COVID-19. He says, but how concerned are the population about the way in which the epidemic has been managed? And then he says, are the Belarusian population, I suppose, are they concerned at all? I presume. So Rihor, can we go to you for this question? I know you've written about it already for Chatham House in an expert comment.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's bad time for him because he's losing popularity because of his response to the COVID-19. At the same time, he showed that actually the election mattered for him more than the COVID-19, and that's why we're actually having this election. So it's a double-edged sword for him. Well, he has to have this election right now, but at the same time, he's losing popularity because of the COVID-19. So yeah, I think that right now he is, of course, thinking that he should had this election a year ago, because actually this was a choice for them to have a parliamentary election or a presidential election now. So, and they decided to have firstly parliamentary election in 2019 and then presidential election. So unfortunately for him, well, the situation is that he has to have this election right now. Speaking about the people's reaction, I think that in a way, people were very concerned firstly, but now it's not anymore, and it's people just relaxing. And maybe the reason for that is that actually there were no regulations from the authorities. So, and it's a huge question from sociological point of view, how long the society can self-regulate itself without the state. I can just easily imagine that even British people will be behaving the same way as Belarusians behave right now if there were no state regulations.
Okay. Andrei, would you like to add to that at all? Thank you. I will move swiftly. Yes, Marina, just so you
yes, just a very short note. I would probably think that COVID-19 was the last straw that broke the camel's back. That
How do you mean?
People who they were able to see with their own eyes and experience this political and social system of Lukashenka. Because what was long in place is the social contract, that you receive some decent amount of money from the state, but you do not demand any political rights or freedoms. And what people saw that around them, in their families, there were people who were very sick, who landed in hospitals, and that was the opposite that they saw on TV, and that was the opposite what the president claimed. Mm-hmm. So it was basically this reaction. On the other hand, is also coming back to the international reaction. Because of the COVID-19, there were all the migrant workers from Belarus who had to leave Russia, Ukraine, and Poland and go back to their own countries. They have no jobs, their family have no incomes, and they also know from the countries that they had to leave that there was a very different reaction to COVID, not protecting the economy, but protecting the people.
Absolutely, thank you. Certainly.
Can I add?
Yes, of course, Andrei.
Yeah. I think that in general, COVID crisis was a disaster for Lukashenka, and it's not only about the system, about welfare state model which was created in Belarus and so on, but this crisis showed some very strange things in his behavior, because it was crisis, it was very difficult situation, and sometimes reactions of the president were just beyond any rational behavior. And I think it was also very important point for many people to decide that he shouldn't be the president at the next elections.
Fair enough, Andrei, but again, it's similar to your previous point. It may have been a disaster for Lukashenko, but it's not so much of a disaster that he's not going to survive it, right?
Yes,
it's for him, that's a disaster. Yeah, okay. All right. I'll move on, if I may. Next question from my friend and counterpart at the Royal United Services Institute, Emily Ferris. Emily asks the Orthodox Church question. Can you speak a little bit about the role of the Belarusian Orthodox Church, given some of their more controversial stances on the COVID issue? Is there evidence that they are becoming more or less active in these elections? And to what extent do you see that they are cooperating with the Russian Orthodox Church? Who would like to take that? I'm not entirely sure. Rihor, Marina, Andrei, anyone? Please raise a hand. Who wants to answer the Orthodox Church question? No one wants to answer the Orthodox Church question. Go on, Rihor. I know you've got to step in, Rihor. You're my man.
Yeah, Marina, please.
Hospital pass.
You are the first.
Did you want to say something, Marina?
Yeah. No. Okay.
Rihor, it's you. Rihor, step in, please.
Okay. Well, I think that basically Belarusians are atheists, and Belarusians generally do not believe in God, and well, at least they are not associate themselves with religion very, very closely. So I think that that's why it's very difficult to say about influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Belarusian politics, because the influence of the church in general is not so huge. And of course they cooperate with the Russian Orthodox Church because, well, Belarusian Orthodox Church is a part of the Russian one. But still, I just cannot say that this influence of the Orthodox Church in Belarus is significant to influence Belarusian politics significantly.
Understood. Anybody else wish to add to that? Yes, Marina.
Yeah, I would only add that Orthodox Church in Belarus is an integral part of Belarusian political system. So you would not expect any different reaction from them. They are in line with everything that the government decides.
Fair enough. Did you put your hand up there, Andrei?
Yes. I'd like just to correct Rihor, because according to sociological research, most of Belarusians are not atheists and they believe in God, but they are not associated closely with church institutions, as Rihor have mentioned.
Understood. Right, we'll move on. Thank you for that, Emily. Alistair, since you have offered so kindly, and it's such a long question, although perhaps I could ask you to shorten it somewhat, can we unmute Alistair Rabaliati, please, for his question? Yeah, all done. Over to you, Alistair. Good to see you.
Thanks, James. So if I'm unmuted. So yeah, three quick questions, and I wrote them up, but I'll try and keep them short. Firstly, in a way, Lukashenko is trying to portray himself as the candidate of peaceful change this time by taking on board this constitution idea that Babarika has thrown out and saying, yes, let's continue on the discussions about changing the constitution, you know, vote for me for slow change, peaceful change, and reject the Maidan riots. So can anything seriously come out of this process? Secondly, you know, 65,000 people signed up last night on the Next platform to say they would come and protest, and 2,000 did. You know, clearly they're going to be. It was a trial run for election night with the authorities blocking all the metro stations and so much police presence you wouldn't believe it. But you know, is there any way to overcome this fear and to enable those who want to protest to do so? And thirdly, you know, there is a space for a political leader to emerge, as Andrei said. You know, the power to some extent is on the streets. Of course, the power is the military on the streets, but or the security forces on the streets. But to some extent, there is room for someone to emerge if someone can get the mobilization or to get the momentum behind them. Whether, you know, Dmitriev or someone like that, Cherechen, could actually you know, get some exposure through these 3 weeks, and what role the Tsepkalo could play in this if he decides to be active in the campaign still, or the Babarika campaign, to still have some momentum still running through to the election day.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned Tsepkalo and Babarika just in the end there, then it sort of mirrors Matei Nellis's question of do Babarika and Tsepkalo have real policy agendas or plans other than just vague promises or reforms? Then I will actually move to Rihor in that case to help out once more. Could you begin to answer, you know, any or all of Alistair's questions, please, Rihor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll probably just take the first one about the constitution changes. Well, frankly speaking, we hear about these constitutional changes for many years, and I think that Vladimir Makey, who was in London like 3 or 4 years ago, he told then the panelists of the meeting that Belarus will have a new constitution very, very soon, and the presidential election will be held under new constitution. Well, unfortunately, or I don't know, it's not happened, and I really doubt that it will happen, because in a way, what we have seen during this presidential campaign is that what Lukashenko wants is just to have power independently and to save this system. And thinking about imagining any reforms in Belarus in a way contradicts everything that we have seen during this campaign.
Understood. Anais, could I turn to you for a second question of Alistair's, which was that 65,000 people said online that they would come out onto the streets, but only 2,000 did, and the authorities scared people away. So what I was asking, is there any step that can be taken, to help a critical mass come out on the streets?
It's not my duty to call people to go to the streets, especially given the risks for their own safety.
What steps might be taken? How might it happen?
First, I would be very careful about the figures, because from what I could see, and I was following live most of the events of yesterday night, people gathered in one place, then they were dispersed, and then they regathered somewhere else. I mean, who, apart from the police, who could with drones count exactly how many people were out? But anyway, we are very much familiar with the problem of social mobilization in Belarus. So indeed, we are maybe collectively celebrating the fact that apparently the Belarusian people is less apathetic than it used to be, and indeed, trying to make its rights respected. But on the other hand, we should be prepared, and that's why I appreciate the realism or pessimism of some of my co-panelists regarding the fact that there will be actually no change, because people are indeed afraid, and they should be. So most of them will eventually, yes, say we will go to the protest online, but then they will just stay home because of the COVID, because of the fear of repression. I think what we can do, what the international community can do, is to really be very extremely vigilant regarding any limitation on the internet freedoms. And I am not familiar with the technicalities. I wonder if Belarus is in the RUNET or not, or how much is it connected to the rest of the world, and how much can it be basically, separated from the rest of the worldwide web, in case the authorities consider that it is necessary to stop any further developments, like from online protests to na plošća protests, and here I think it puts a lot of responsibility also on the diplomats who are in Minsk, and eventually those who are in the regions, to also be extremely reactive and extremely careful whenever they would notice any attempt at limiting the free flow of information, including on Telegram channels, because this is how people are actually not only seeking information now from bloggers, from those who are not in jail at least, and also self-organizing the protests, because what we can see is that there is indeed no leader, no coordination committee, nothing. It's extremely spontaneous, and it only relies on these Telegram channels or other social networks. And the minute we will see this being cut, then there will be no more eyes on location to just see the crackdown.
Andrei, it was very unfair of me to push all three of Alice's questions on you. So can I ask you the last one, please, Andrei, which is, or the last part of the last one, really. What role can Tsepkalo and Babarika play going forward? Did they have any concrete plans, any positive agendas? What's the future for them? And is there the possibility, and I've been asking this question for decades, of course, but is there a possibility of a space for a new leader to emerge? Over to you, Andrei.
I just don't see any mechanisms using I just don't see any mechanism for changes. If you speak about such leaders like Babarika and Tsepkalo, because elections is not a mechanism in Belarus. The alternative one is some kind of social protest and so on and so forth. But it seems that Belarusian authorities just has power and force enough to bring them down. So I don't see any clear, at least, future for Babarika and Tsepkalo as political projects. Probably Babarika, but no, I don't think that they will be able to change the scenario of the authorities.
Okay, thank you, Andrei. Right. Oh, Marina, yes, please.
Yes. To support the very important intervention from Anais, that the West should very closely observe what's happening in the country. But I also wanted to sprinkle some optimism into all the things that have been just said by the colleagues. Of course, we would need a crystal ball to be able to say what's going to happen next. But there are clearly a couple of very visible trends that can be observed. There is this very serious politicization and mobilization of the society at large. It's not only people interested in politics, people being part of political parties or civic groups. It's very anarchic, of course. But the main idea is now that the system has to be changed, that they do not want Lukashenka to remain in power. So it's not that much about the leaders, that they rally behind Babarika or Tsepkalo because they see them as presidents or political leaders. It's just that they were the figures that could symbolize the most of what they expect the leader to do. Babarika, for example, was emotionally and I mean, in his video appearances, the complete opposite of Lukashenka, not accusing others and being aggressive and negative, but saying, we will do it, what we have achieved so far, it's all thanks to you, I love you all, and let's all stay in touch. So it's a very new trend, and I would not shrug it off as saying that the 9th of August, elections as always take place and Lukashenko wins, and there's no follow-up, no groups collecting signatures for the referendum to change the constitution and so on and so forth. Because it's this is the trend that goes to the core of the Belarusian society, and it's very important to observe it and follow it.
Thank you. That's very interesting, Marina. Appreciate it. Right. Question next from Freya Hogan. Change of tack here. Lukashenko indicated in a recent speech that the military should be prepared to step in and deal with internal issues rather than just looking at the external side of things. Do you think it's likely that the military will step in, or is it just scare tactics in an attempt to lower the number of people that come out to protest? Who would like to take that? I could nominate, but volunteers before I do? Rihor and Andrei. Great. Rihor, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I can briefly just respond to that. Well, as we see protests that are taking place right now, that they are self-organized and there are plenty of protests. For example, yesterday it was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 protests in Minsk and even near Minsk in Novaya Borovaya. So I think that actually there are not so many police force that Lukashenko has to, to respond to all these small protests. And we can imagine that, for example, the 9th of August, there will be many protests across the whole country. So probably, in a way, he will not have much choice, but actually to use everything he has.
I think that it's obvious that security and preservation of power is the main priority for Lukashenko, and he will use all means necessary to preserve his power. So actually it depends on the challenges. If there will be a great number of people on the streets and the capacity of police will be not enough to suppress these protests, he will use military power. For me, it's obvious. But of course, at the moment, it's more about intimidations. It's more about intimidation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. Okay, a question from a former colleague of mine, Ksenia Shvedova. It's a Russia question, but it might not be for you, Kolya. Maybe more for Rihor. Let's have a look. What is Russia's take on the Belgazprom bank case and the allegations made by the Belarusian authorities with regards to the possible involvement of senior Gazprom officials? What does it tell us about Belarus-Russia relations? Do you want to comment on the Belgazprom bank case, Rihor?
Well, I think that...
Let me know, Kolya, if you want to comment as well. Just put your hand up.
Yeah.
Sorry,
well,
Rihor.
I think that they're trying to show that actually they do not care much. And in a way, it makes sense then because actually they will still have a huge leverage on Lukashenko after the election. So they just try not to interfere right now into this election because they are pretty sure that the outcome of this election will be very, very good for them, that Belarus will be in depression under sanctions and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Kolya, you said you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I think that both sides, Belarus himself and Gazprom, did say officially that Belarus is acting on his own. And although Gazprom did, reject any accusations of wrongdoing for the bank, and they did criticize some of police actions, they did not back Belarus. But what is important, I think, there are some signs that Lukashenko and Putin, do have certain agreements, like say Lukashenko came to Rzev together with Putin to open this huge military monument recently. And yesterday it has been announced that Russian-Belarusian border should be opened, which means that the Kremlin is eager to make some very small concessions, but the pressure will increase after elections.
Understood. Another Russia question, although not necessarily because you have to a certain extent answered this yourself. But Alex Kocherov asks, the Kremlin is likely to view a 2020 election as a weakening of Lukashenko's position, both domestically and in relations with Russia. Would that mean that Russia would be more or less likely to increase pressure on Lukashenko on the issues of bilateral Belarusian-Russian integration? Kolya, I feel you've answered that question as it happens. I mean, you did answer it earlier, but so would anybody else like to take it on? It's not solely within Kolya's purview. Anybody else, I think, can answer, has the requisite expertise to talk about the Russia dimension. So
Russia will increase pressure, and the only question is the extent of pressure that it will use on Belarus in this case.
Mm-hmm. Rihor, and then I might ask Kolya to comment on your responses. But Rihor first.
Yeah, I think it would be very, very unwise not for Russia not to use this opportunity. When Lukashenko will be weak, Belarus will be under sanctions. So it's like, it seems for me that it's very, very likely.
I see, but Russia will increase the pressure. Marina, Anais, please.
I would probably raise a different point in this respect. It would be probably if the internal pressure increases for Lukashenko. It's a real danger that he will make all kinds of concessions and probably even end Belarusian sovereignty to remain in power. If Russia guarantees that he will stay the president of Belarus and the state symbols will remain. And this is a very dangerous, that would be a very dangerous twist if Russia increases pressure.
Indeed. Anais, you unmuted yourself, so I assume you have something to say. Please do.
No, I'm sorry,
No?
I cannot speak today, not as special rapporteur, not on this.
Okay, I understand. Sorry, I thought because you unmuted yourself, you were wanting to say something. Okay, I will move on. Question from Albertina Snihir. There are appeals and instructions for people how to behave during election day to make the process as transparent and as fair as possible and to prevent falsifications. Do you think it's possible to influence the process in a positive way? Anybody? Who would like to take it? Andrei again, perhaps. Can the process be influenced? Yes.
How can you influence the situation if two the most
Andrei, we lost you for a second.
Yes, if two most popular candidates were deprived their right to be represented at these elections. If we just don't have alternative leaders at these elections. So I think that the question of transparency and any fairness is not on the table because it's too late to think about transparency if you just don't have the leaders of alternative political forces.
Thank you for the question. I was in the suburb for 3-4 times, and once was even expelled from the polling station. And I think that actually it's possible to influence the process if you have many observers. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult because actually as an observer in Belarus, you have no right. And this election, you don't have a right even to make a photo of the process or photo of the election commission. So unfortunately, the only way is just to have many observers.
Fair enough. Okay. But yeah, Marina. You and Marina then Anais, doesn't matter. Marina, please.
Anais, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's possible to influence the outcome of the election now that the precinct electoral commissions are already constituted. They're fully dominated by the administration, the administrative bodies that manage the election and that will come up with the wanted results. And I know there are already serious obstacles for people to register as domestic observers as well. So, and this is not a suggestion from my side, but I think the only way to influence the election at this stage would be a massive boycott. And this has been just mentioned, it's been discussed. However, those who are allowed to run and who have, gathered after all these efforts, they have gathered support among the population, etc. I don't think they will want to backpedal and not run. Of course, it wouldn't be fair. But I believe the only way just to demonstrate that this is not an election in the real sense of the term is for people not to go to the polling station, and then it will be evident if there is 70% participation and 80% in favor of Lukashenko. It will be a very good proof that the election has been manipulated.
What would be the effect of the boycott, Anais?
Excuse me?
What would be the effect of a boycott?
Well, showing that there is a discrepancy between the real turnout and the one which is reported.
I understand, but what would the real world effect be? What would happen?
Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think anything that can show the discrepancies in the absence of domestic or international observers is a possibility, at least to show that these are not democratic elections, and then from it derive conclusions about the legitimacy of the process and the elected president.
Fair enough. Marina, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah. Not sure I completely agree with Anais, but that since 1994 there haven't been any elections that took place. This electoral machinery is working smoothly, and there's nothing to stop it. There are basically no elections, no free and fair process, not to campaign, or lead campaign, or to count votes. 2 decades is a very long term to secure the system. The boycott is one possibility to try, but I think another very serious possibility is that the politicization and mobilization of the society will be, will rise to a degree that the elites will be split. Of members of the bureaucratic apparatus, and then basically the appointed members of the precinct committees will not take part in the fraud operations.
Thank you, Marina. This, Rihor, is why we are delaying your paper on the Belarusian elites, in case it is split after the election. There's about, let me see, 10 minutes to go, so I may have time for 1 or 2 last questions if anybody wants to ask. But in the meantime, from my colleague Orysia Lutsevich, head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, Rihor and Andrei, do you see any Zelensky effect in the current campaign? Another way of putting it is can an outsider inspire people?
Yes, obviously.
Oh, no, okay, Andrei, go on then. Please, Andrei.
Yes, obviously, I think that Babarika is some kind of Zelensky phenomena. It's very, there are many correlations between these political phenomena, and of course, outsider can inspire the people, but Belarus is not a democracy. So now this Belarusian Zelensky is not a president, but political prisoner. So we just have some different conditions concerning such political phenomena like Zelensky in Ukraine.
Well, I can just add that actually Babarika was a very inspiring outsider, and in a way his campaign showed it was tremendous. Well, it's already stopped, but its beginning was very tremendous. Like he announced his candidacy, and in a week he had like almost 10,000 people in his team, and then he collected almost 500,000 signatures. It's magnificent.
Extraordinary. I have a final question, probably from my colleague Keir, the backup chair. Keir says, can we go back to Alex Kocharov's question and take it a step further? The speakers agree that Russia will exert more influence and Lukashenko will be susceptible to it. But how is Russia most likely to use that influence? Alex mentioned integration and military cooperation. What will be the top of Russia's wish list, and what are the most likely consequences? I think firstly to you, Kolya, but I'll go around as well.
We've already spoken about increasing Russia's pressure, and I think it depends what exactly we do mean when speaking about pressure. so far I think Belarusian economic model is not self-sustainable, and it needs Russian money to survive. There are no chances for any serious changes in this economic model, which makes Belarusian economy, not just Lukashenka, very dependent from Russia. And it's not even a kind of pressure, it's more or less natural. Then when giving something, you do wait for something to get in exchange. And Russian-Belarusian relations so far did not look as any kind of real exchange, and now Russia's position did change. In this sense, Russia's pressure will increase, and there is economic and political dimension. In terms of economic dimension, it's quite understandable that what Russia is claiming for now, it's getting control. Well, it's going on for pretty long. It's getting control over certain assets which are considered to be, attractive for Russian business, and letting Russian business to come, which I think is becoming less and less attractive as Belarusian economy is becoming more and more old-fashioned. In terms of politics, I've mentioned that Russia, even now, although it's not connected to the 2024 problem, needs to demonstrate a kind of very cordial development of the Union state, which can be used by Putin in order to increase his legitimacy. But I think that, well, there is very special position of Russian military. Their view is that Russia and Belarus do form the single military space, which is important, although new technologies does not make Russian military and Russian security that much dependent from Russian military bases in Belarus. But Russian elites and Russian military elites are still sure that it's extremely important not to let anybody like NATO, even a threat of NATO, to take Belarus out of this very strong cooperation. So I do think that there is the whole wish list of Russian business and of Russian military, which will be which is pretty well known in Belarus for Lukashenka for sure, and which will be used after elections.
Marina, can I ask you the same question, or just a part of Kia's question? You know, what is at the top of Russia's wish list right now, as far as Belarus is concerned?
I'm also not sure that I am qualified to say that there is a wish list, but I wouldn't say that there are any economic goals or targets for Russia in this case. This is political influence. This is having Belarus as a buffer zone between Russia and the West, and having this very loyal, basically not 100% loyal, but the president that they know very well and can count on, I mean, Lukashenka.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to comment on the Russia question before I effectively close up? No, I'm not seeing any hands from amongst the panelists. So in that case, it just remains for me to thank everybody, of course, our 5 very game and very knowledgeable speakers for covering the whole waterfront and getting as good a view of this deteriorating situation as we could possibly get from where we are, Minsk in Andrei's case, but everywhere else and everywhere else is. Riho and I do have plans, of course, and although Riho is due to return to Minsk himself, at least to renew his visa, so it'll only take a couple of years, in the next week or so, then we do plan to hold another event immediately after the election, especially if something significant happens, maybe to assess the repercussions of the election. So we may have a date for it already, Riho or Anna, I can't quite remember, maybe wouldn't be the 9th, but it must be middle of August, I presume. So watch this space, but in the meantime, look out for that and look out for, as I said, Rihor's forthcoming paper on Belarusian elites, which is going through the peer review process as we speak. So thank you again to everybody, and we will see you next time, not least hopefully for the disinformation event chaired by Keir on Friday. If you don't know about it, ask Anna. Thank you and goodbye.